welcomed the clandestine cases. It was the sort of morning St. Giles Manor rarely knew. Bright sun glancing off polished windows, the scent of honeysuckle drifting through open doors, and not a single footfall in the halls. Which made it all the more unsettling when Mrs. Randall, the housekeeper, found the butler, Mr. Tilling, dead in the library, his lifeless form crumpled beside the writing desk. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no broken window or open door. The room had been locked from the inside. Mr. Tilling had been with the family for over 30 years, quiet, precise, and unfailingly loyal. For someone so regimented to die, in such disarray, one shoe half off, glasses broken, his ink-stained hand still clutching a fountain pen, was beyond odd. The only item out of place was a single envelope, sealed and resting on the blotter. It was addressed in the butler's careful hand to Lady Honoria Greaves, the mistress of the house. Mrs. Randall had hesitated only a moment before picking it up and slipping it into her apron. The constable arrived within the hour, all local, urgency and rural courtesy. He examined the scene and frowned over the absence of trauma or toxins. The window was locked, the fireplace cold. No glass or food bore traces of poison. A locked room death certainly, but without the theatrical flair of crime novels. The letter, unopened, was handed to Lady Greaves once the coroner departed. She read it in silence at the breakfast table, her gloved fingers trembling only slightly. Then she folded it and said nothing. The family physician listed the death as natural, likely a heart failure. No further inquiry was deemed necessary. But Miss Marple, who had arrived for her summer visit just the day before, found this quite unsatisfactory. It wasn't the fact of death that troubled her. It was its timing. Mr. Tilling had been alive and well during dinner, serving with his usual precision. By morning he was dead on the floor, the door locked from within and a single letter left behind. Why write a letter before dying of natural causes? Why address it to Lady Greaves? And why did Lady Greaves hide it in her handbag instead of mentioning it aloud? Miss Marple sat quietly that afternoon beneath the rose arbor, knitting a particularly difficult pattern of double lace and considering. St. Giles Manor was not the sort of place where servants died mysteriously. It was the sort of place where gossip drifted in the afternoon air like dandelion seeds, and where secrets had long legs and gentle voices. And yet, no one gossiped about Mr. Tilling. That, she thought, was odd in itself. At tea, Miss Marple asked, a question so delicately phrased it didn't even register as an inquiry. "How very sudden these heart failures are, aren't they?" she said, smiling gently. "Though I've always thought men like Mr. Tilling would simply never allow themselves to die unexpectedly. Such tidy habits, he'd have made an appointment for it." Lady Greaves responded with a vague nod, her face unreadable. Colonel Greaves changed the subject, and Mrs. Randall busied herself with the cake. It was the gardener, of all people, who gave the first clue without meaning to. He was in the shed the day before, he told Miss Marple while trimming the hedge. Looking for sealing wax, said he had something he wanted to make private. Sealing wax, of course, had not been used in the house for years. The letter, Miss Marple realized, had been prepared carefully with deliberate intent. Not dashed off in the last throes of chest pain, and not meant as a farewell. No, it had the feel of testimony, something sealed for its weight, not its sentiment. Yet the contents remained hidden. That evening, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Randall if she had seen the letter after it was read. Mrs. Randall hesitated, then admitted that she had just briefly. "There was a name at the top," she whispered. "But I only caught a glance, it wasn't hers. I think it said Edwin." There was no Edwin in the household, not now. But there had been once. Edwin Greaves, the youngest son, had died in an automobile accident a decade ago. Everyone remembered the scandal faintly, and few spoke of it now. Yet Miss Marple remembered the whispers from a Christmas letter, a question about who had been behind the wheel. The next morning she walked with Lady Greaves in the garden and remarked upon the beauty of the delphiniums. "You know," she added lightly, "I've always admired how you managed after poor Edwin passed, tragic as it was. And so much confusion at the time, wasn't there? Who was with him? How it happened? But all families have their shadows." Lady Greaves paused. Her lips were tight, but she said nothing. That evening, Miss Marple asked to see the letter. Politely, softly, like a dear friend wishing to pay her respects to an old servant. Lady Greaves refused. It was Colonel Greaves who finally caved. He approached Miss Marple quietly after supper. He accused her, the Colonel muttered, said she had lied all these years about Edwin, that she had bribed the driver to vanish, paid off the inspector. Tilling knew it all, said he had proof. The letter was a threat. Miss Marple looked at him calmly. "And now he is dead." The Colonel sighed. "Natural causes. That's what the doctor said." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And what do doctors know about unnatural intentions? The locked room, the sealed letter, the years-old scandal, the timing. And now, a mystery forming around something that had already been buried once." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her knitting untouched on the table. The crime had no visible hand, no weapon, no break-in, but what it did have was intent, hidden beneath civility, cloaked in grief, and wrapped up in a butler's last letter. Miss Marple was never one to overstep. Her presence in the house remained that of a quiet guest, unassuming, observant, rarely the first to speak unless the moment required it. But when Inspector Cray arrived from the county station the next afternoon, summoned belatedly after the household's growing unease, she saw the opportunity to begin knitting together threads that were already stretching taut. The inspector was a broad-shouldered man with the weary look of someone used to dismissing the opinions of those not in uniform. He gave her a cordial nod when introduced, and then directed his attention firmly to Lady Greaves and the facts already logged by the village constable. "It's likely a natural passing," Cray concluded, reviewing the notes over a lukewarm cup of tea in the drawing-room. "Though I'll have the letter logged if you've kept it." Lady Greaves blinked once, her posture shifting ever so slightly. "Unfortunately, I no longer have it," she said. "I burned it. I thought it best. It felt too personal." Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, did not look up, but she saw the tightening in the Colonel's jaw, the way his fingers flexed slightly on the arm of his chair. That reaction was not grief. It was restraint. A moment later, Cray asked what the letter had said. "It was sentimental," Lady Greaves replied. "A goodbye, really, after so many years of service." The explanation was unchallenged, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the small round burn mark on the brass ashtray on the writing desk in the library. Someone had placed something upon it, let it smoulder, then turned it to ash with care. It had not been used during tea or since. She waited until the room cleared before examining it closely once more. The mark was fresh. Not from a cigarette or a cigar, but something larger. A folded sheet, perhaps, with edges pressed tight. Burned. Too neatly to be an accident. That evening, during a short walk along the edge of the garden, Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Cray as if by accident. "It's funny how people lie," she mused. "Not maliciously, always. Sometimes out of habit, or guilt, or fear that a very old truth might be worse than a very new lie." Cray chuckled lightly. "You think Lady Greaves is lying?" "I think she's hiding," Miss Marple replied. "Which is not the same thing. One can lie with the truth after all. Omission is quite the art form here in the country." The next morning brought a chill wind through the corridors of St. Giles Manor, along with a second development. The gardener's apprentice, a young man named Martin, was discovered packing a rucksack behind the stables. When asked why he was leaving without notice, he grew flustered, claimed he had planned to visit his mother, then changed his story twice more in the span of 5 minutes. Inspector Cray questioned him formally, though gently, and Martin finally admitted that he had seen something he shouldn't have. A candle burning in the library at 2 in the morning, long after everyone had retired. "But the door was locked," he said. "And when I passed again half an hour later it was dark." "Did you try the handle?" Cray asked. Martin shook his head. "No, sir. Just saw the light through the crack." Miss Marple, listening quietly, interjected. "And did you happen to notice if the light flickered?" "Candles do that, you know." Martin nodded. "It did. Real flame, not the electric ones. That placed someone in the library after Mr. Tilling should have been long dead. Either he was alive longer than assumed, or someone entered the locked room after the fact." Inspector Cray rubbed his chin and turned his suspicions toward the housekeeper, who had keys to every room. But Mrs. Randall insisted she had locked the library after finding the body, and the key had not left her ring since. The ring, which she produced, bore no signs of recent tampering. Still, Cray requested it be kept in his possession. Mrs. Randall seemed offended, but yielded with dignity. While the inspector puzzled over access and time of death, Miss Marple wandered through the house alone, pausing in the library. She noticed for the first time that the desk's blotter had a faint crease not aligned with any current stationery. Something once rested there, larger than the envelope that held the letter. A photograph, perhaps, or a folded paper of another kind. The wastebasket had been emptied, but the fire grate told another story. There were remnants of paper there, brittle and blackened, with a faint blue tinge that looked nothing like regular parchment. Thin edges, corners too sharp. Carbon copy paper, perhaps. Of what, one could only guess. She returned to her room and waited until dusk. The house fell into its familiar hush, broken only by the soft chimes of the drawing-room clock and the distant rattle of the wind against the windows. Then quietly she made her way downstairs and sought out Colonel Greaves. He was in his study, nursing a brandy. "I do beg your pardon," she said, "but I think someone used your fireproof cabinet. Recently." He blinked. "What makes you say that?" "Because Mr. Tilling would never burn a letter if he wanted someone to read it, but he would place something else in a safe location if he feared it might be destroyed. And the family doesn't keep a fireproof cabinet for sentimental reasons, do they?" Colonel Greaves hesitated. "We used to keep Edwin's school records in there. And the inquest papers. And perhaps Mr. Tilling added something of his own?" she asked, voice gentle. "Say, a second copy of the letter? Or another document entirely?" The colonel did not answer. But that evening, long after the house had gone to bed, he unlocked the cabinet, removed a flat folder, and brought it to the inspector. Cray opened it in silence, studied its contents, then looked at Miss Marple. "I think you'd best stay another day," he said. "This is no longer a matter of heart failure." Miss Marple gave a slight nod and folded her hands. The first falsehood had cracked, and behind it, something darker waited to be uncovered. The folder retrieved from the fireproof cabinet was slimmer than expected. It contained a single sheet of typed paper, the ink faint along the right edge, as though the ribbon had been worn thin. At the top was the heading, "Statement regarding the circumstances surrounding the death of Edwin Greaves, dated April 4th, 1933. The signature at the bottom, unmistakable even through the smudge of ink, belonged to Charles Tilling. The contents detailed a conversation overheard in the servants' corridor between Lady Greaves and an unknown man just days before Edwin's fatal accident, a quarrel about silence, about money, and about a threat Edwin had made to reveal everything, unless something was done to stop him. The man was never named, but the butler had included a description: tall, wiry, a limp in the left leg, and a pale scar below the ear. Not a single family member fit that description. Inspector Cray had read the page 3 times and said nothing. Miss Marple read it once and said only, This is not the full letter. The following morning the household was gathered one by one to speak with the inspector. Miss Marple was not formally included, but Cray made no objection to her quiet presence in the corner. He had begun to see the peculiar value in her silence. First came Mrs. Randall, her hands clasped tight before her. She recounted her discovery of the body again and again in identical language, until even she seemed exhausted by her repetition. When asked if she ever overheard staff speak of Edwin's accident, she hesitated. "Only that it was a terrible loss," she said carefully, "and that Lady Greaves stopped speaking to her sister after the funeral. I never knew why." "Her sister?" Cray asked. "Was she close to the family?" "She visited the summer before Edwin died. Stayed a fortnight. Then she vanished. Her name was Clarice." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. She had heard the name once before, in a letter Lady Greaves had torn up at the breakfast table during her first visit years ago. But no one had ever mentioned a sister since. Next came young Martin, still jittery from his failed escape. He denied entering the library, denied touching anything, but admitted that he'd once heard Mr. Tilling arguing with someone in the pantry. "A man," he said. Deep voice, sounded like he'd come from town. "What did they argue about?" "Couldn't make it out," Martin said. "But Mr. Tilling said, 'You think I'm afraid of you.' And the man said, 'You should be, old man.' Then it went quiet." Miss Marple observed the boy's boots as he spoke, mud along the inner, heel but not on the toe, suggesting he'd been crouched in the flower beds recently. When he left, she noted the gardener's expression, watchful, unusually so. Cray summoned him next. Mr. Hurst, a stiff-backed man with sun-spotted skin, had been on the grounds for nearly 2 decades. "I never liked the man," he said bluntly, when asked about the butler. "Too knowing. Always listening at doors." "Did you see anything unusual the night he died?" "No more than usual," Hurst said. "Though the house cat wouldn't go near the library that night. Sat outside the door mewling till morning. Animals are often sensitive," Miss Marple remarked gently, "especially when something isn't quite right." The gardener gave her a look, flat, unreadable. "Or when someone locks them in the wrong room." When he left, Cray leaned forward and murmured, "He's holding something back, but not out of guilt, out of fear." "Fear of whom?" Miss Marple asked. It was time they agreed to speak with the family directly. Colonel Greaves came first. His manner was steady, but his eyes betrayed strain. When asked if he recognized the man described in the statement, wiry, limping, scarred, he denied it at once. "Never heard of such a person," he said. "Certainly not anyone welcomed in this house." "And Clarice," Miss Marple added quietly. "Did she ever mention such a man?" The colonel stiffened. "Clarice died 5 years ago, in France. She had troubles. We never spoke of them. But she was here," Miss Marple said, "the summer before Edwin's death. And she argued with your wife, did she not?" His silence stretched too long. When Lady Greaves entered, she wore her reserve-like armor. Her responses were precise, practiced. "No, I do not remember any man like that. No, I have not seen the letter since. Yes, I burned it for privacy. No, I had no knowledge of." "What Mr. Tilling intended, and Clarice?" Miss Marple asked again, not with challenge but with softness. "What happened between you?" "She involved herself where she had no business," Lady Greaves replied, her voice suddenly brittle. "Edwin was a troubled boy. He fell in with dangerous people. I did what I had to do to protect this family. And Mr. Tilling," her lips pressed together, "he thought he could unearth something buried for good reason." When she left, Cray exhaled slowly. "Every answer leads to a deeper well." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And we must follow the rope until we find who's holding the other end. A quiet tension had settled over the household. Footsteps were softer. Voices dropped to whispers. Even the maids avoided the library now, though no one had said as much aloud. Miss Marple wandered once more through the ground floor, her gaze catching on the brass bellboard in the servants' corridor. A single wire hung askew, library. Not pulled recently, but frayed at the end as though yanked hard. A broken connection. She ran her finger along the board's edge and found a smudge. Grease, perhaps, or something darker. A sign someone had tampered with it. At supper she watched the guests. Mrs. Randall served with tight-lipped professionalism. Martin stared at his plate. Colonel Greaves drank too quickly. And Lady Greaves never looked up once. Later that evening, Cray met Miss Marple by the drawing-room fire. "We've uncovered lies," he said, "but no proof." "Not yet," she agreed. "But someone is weaving threads, and one of them leads to the man in the description, a man who may not be entirely in the past." Cray looked puzzled. "You think he's still alive?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "No, I think he's still here." The rain arrived during the night, soft at first, then steady, blanketing St. Giles Manor in a hush that muted every footfall and closed in the air like a secret. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and watched from her window as the mist settled in the orchard and the gravel paths turned to slush. This kind of weather, she thought, tended to make people careless. It blurred sharp edges, fogged intentions, and encouraged the truth to slip through cracks if one only knew where to listen. She joined Inspector Cray in the breakfast room, where the fire hissed quietly and the tea had gone tepid. He had spread papers before him, statements, observations, and a sketch timeline that refused to align neatly. "We have too many answers and not enough consistency," he muttered. "Everyone has a reason. None of them match." Miss Marple, sipping delicately from her cup, nodded. "Then perhaps we begin not with who had reason, but who had opportunity." He tapped his finger on the timeline. Lady Greaves claims to have been asleep by 10. Colonel Greaves was in his study, alone. Mrs. Randall retired shortly after locking the library. Martin said he went out to check the gate, though no one saw him return. Hurst was in the greenhouse where no one can verify. Too many shadows. Then we must ask, which shadow fears the light most? Miss Marple said. They began with Martin. Called once again into the drawing room, the boy looked thinner than before, paler. "I told you everything," he said. "I saw the light in the library, and that's all." "But you didn't mention the letter," Cray said. "Or that you'd once been in trouble with the law. Small theft, wasn't it? Caught stealing from a former employer." Martin blinked. "That was years ago. I was 16. You're 20 now," Cray said evenly. "Old enough to recognize when something's worth more than coin. Did you try to steal the letter?" "No." Martin's voice cracked. "I didn't even go in." Miss Marple's tone remained soft. "Then why did you try to leave so suddenly? Was someone threatening you?" His eyes darted. The answer too long in coming. "I saw someone," he said finally. "In the corridor after midnight. But I didn't want to say. I wasn't supposed to be awake." "Who?" Cray demanded. Martin hesitated, then whispered, "The gardener, Mr. Hurst." Hurst denied it, of course. He'd been in the greenhouse tending the orchids that couldn't bear the night chill. But when pressed, his story shifted. He admitted to crossing the corridor, just once, he said, to fetch a kettle of hot water. "I thought I heard something in the library," he added grudgingly. "But the door was locked." Miss Marple asked gently, "And did you knock?" "No," he said. "Didn't seem my place." "And yet you stayed near enough for Martin to see you." Hurst scowled. The boy's mistaken. But the timing placed him dangerously close to the critical window after the house had settled before the body was found. And his dislike for Tilling had been no secret. Nor was his history with Edwin Greaves once whispered among staff. It was said Edwin had once caught Hurst stealing fertilizer for his private garden and threatened to report him. After Edwin's death, the threat vanished with him. The colonel, when asked about this, merely shook his head. That was years ago. Edwin never reported it. We chose to keep Hurst on. And yet Mr. Tilling kept a record of the incident, Cray added, producing a second page from the folder, a personnel file with dates, annotations, and a note about Edwin's suspicions. Miss Marple noticed how the colonel's gaze flicked, not at Cray, but toward his wife. Lady Greaves sat nearby, reading a letter she'd yet to open. Her calm was too deliberate. "Lady Greaves," Miss Marple said quietly, "why did you truly burn the butler's letter?" She looked up slowly. "Because it was poison," she said, her voice cold. "Not just to me, to everyone. Charles thought it was best to let the past remain where it belonged. But the past rarely does," Miss Marple said, "especially when the present is being strangled by it." The colonel stood abruptly. "We had nothing to gain by Tilling's death." "But others did," Cray said. "Let's consider motive. Mrs. Randall, it emerged, had her own. A footnote in the house ledger revealed a discrepancy, funds missing from the silver account over the past 2 years. Small amounts, just enough to be overlooked. Tilling, it seemed, had noticed. A handwritten note in his journal, retrieved from his bedroom drawer, read only, 'Speak to Randall about kitchen accounts.' She denied theft, swore she'd only moved the funds to cover unpaid bills, but the evidence was damning. He was going to speak to the family, she admitted. He said it would be better if it came from me first. I was going to tell them after Sunday service." "Or not at all," Cray said. "Then there was Hurst, with the old grievance and late-night presence. Martin, with the petty theft and odd timing, Mrs. Randall, with a motive soaked in fear, and still Lady Greaves, who had more to lose than all of them. If the full contents of Tilling's letter were ever made public, her role in Edwin's fate, whatever it truly was, would come under harsh scrutiny." Miss Marple sat quietly that evening in the parlor, her knitting untouched. She was no longer sorting through suspects. She was tracing the thread of intent. "There's too much coincidence," she told Cray. "Tilling prepares a letter. He seals it. He makes a copy and hides it. Then he dies in a locked room, and a candle is seen burning hours later. You think he was killed after writing it?" "No," she said. "I think he was interrupted. The letter was never posted. He placed the copy in the cabinet, left the original on his desk, and someone came for it. Perhaps to destroy it. Perhaps to silence him. But how was the door locked from inside?" Miss Marple tapped her chin. "There's only one key. But there are tricks. An old string, a latch dropped with a knife slid under the door. These things have been used before by those with reason." "Then the murder was staged," Cray muttered. "And the motive," she said, "is not one, it is many. Each person here is tangled in it, knowingly or not. We must stop looking for a single reason. We must ask instead, who most needed Tilling silent right then? Not yesterday, not last year, but this week." Cray glanced at the fireproof folder once more. "Then we start again, from the moment he began typing." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And when we find out what he meant to include but didn't, we will find the hand that ended his sentence for good. It was the gardener, Hurst, who broke first. Under mounting pressure and after a long evening of questioning, he confessed not to murder, but to tampering with the scene. He admitted that he'd found the library door ajar in the early hours of the morning, discovered Tilling slumped in his chair, and in a moment of panic and ignorance, locked the door from inside using an old trick he'd learned in his youth. A bit of string threaded through the keyhole to pull the latch back after shutting the door. I thought it'd look more peaceful, he said quietly, his weathered face hollow with guilt, like he passed alone, with dignity. He didn't deserve scandal. Inspector Cray seized on the admission as the key to the locked room puzzle. "That's it then," he said later in the drawing room, pacing before the fire with his notes in hand. Tilling died of heart failure or stroke, and Hurst, fearing blame or suspicion, staged the scene. No murder, just a fool's panic. The sealed letter, the cabinet file. It all points to a man burdened by old guilt and secrets he feared would die with him. A house full of tensions, but no crime. Just decay. Colonel Greaves seemed relieved. Lady Greaves said little. Martin offered no protest, and Mrs. Randall excused herself quietly. A final report would be written, Cray promised, and the matter laid to rest. The coroner's initial conclusion of natural death could stand. He would recommend discretion. But Miss Marple sat unmoving. Her tea had long gone cold. The firelight cast soft shadows across the rug, and she stared at them with narrowed eyes, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Something had curdled. The logic, while tidy, rang false to her ear. Hurst's story explained the mechanics, but not the motive. And motive was everything. She found Cray later that evening in the library. "Forgive me," she said gently, "but have you considered why Tilling left the letter sealed on the desk? Not posted, not handed over, simply left in the open." Cray exhaled through his nose. "You think it was bait?" "No," she said. "I think it was unfinished, or perhaps he left it there because he knew it would be found, and that it might force the truth into the light. He was exposing Lady Greaves." "Yes, but not just her. There's something more." She stepped toward the writing desk and gestured to the inkwell. The ink was fresh, still tacky when the body was found, yet there's no blotting paper used. Why would a man known for precision leave wet ink exposed? Cray frowned. Because he never finished writing. Someone interrupted him mid-sentence. And the letter, sealed or not, was never complete. Miss Marple leaned forward and pointed at the corner of the blotter. A faint mark, barely visible, an impression from another sheet, pressed too hard. She took a sheet of plain paper and ran a pencil lightly across it. Faint letters emerged, the ghost of a phrase. Not Clarice. Not her. The man with the scar. Cray froze. He was writing about the scarred man again. Because he had just learned something. Something that changed his understanding of Edwin's death. But Clarice died years ago, Cray muttered. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "But perhaps someone used her name recently, perhaps in a forged letter, or perhaps she never died at all." Cray stared at her. "It would explain much," she said. "The hush, the family silence, the rage in that letter. If she returned and confronted someone, Tilling included, and if she knew the truth about Edwin, well, she would have become a danger." Cray's certainty faltered. "But there's no record of her after 1933. Records can be altered, and people can disappear quite thoroughly if they have help." The next morning, Cray attempted to reopen the inquiry, but pressure had already mounted from the family solicitor. Discretion was encouraged. The house was to resume normalcy. The staff returned to routine. No one wanted further scandal. Hurst had been dismissed but without prosecution. Cray filed a preliminary close to the investigation, citing no evidence of foul play. His instincts told him something was wrong, but the machinery around him demanded closure. Miss Marple, however, remained. She wandered the library once more that afternoon. The rain had cleared, leaving the manor bathed in cold sunlight. Dust. Motes drifted in slanted light. Her fingers traced the edge of the desk, then paused by the fireplace. She knelt and looked again at the burned papers. Something about them nagged at her. One half-charred scrap bore a stamped corner, not the family's crest, not official, a foreign postmark. France. She tucked the scrap into her sleeve and returned to her room. That evening she asked Lady Greaves to take tea with her in private. The invitation was met with stiff politeness, but Lady Greaves arrived promptly at 5. "I remember Clarice," Miss Marple said once they were seated. "Vivid woman. Restless. She never fit in here, did she?" Lady Greaves stared, silent. "She wrote to Mr. Tilling, didn't she? Not long before his death, no response. I found a scrap of the envelope, French postmark, burned in your fireplace." Still silence. Miss Marple let the pause stretch. "She accused you, didn't she? Or perhaps your husband? Or perhaps both? Of letting Edwin die, or worse, of ensuring he did?" At last Lady Greaves spoke. She should have stayed dead. The words fell into the silence like a stone. Her voice was even. "She came back to extort us, said she'd go to the press, said she had a copy of Edwin's medical records, proof he'd been drugged, a sedative in his brandy the night he died. Charles had given it to him to calm his nerves. He was driving too recklessly, threatening to expose our affairs. We only meant to stop him from leaving the house that night, not kill him. And Tilling. He found out when Clarice wrote him. Said he'd go to the police if we didn't confess. I burned the letter. But he made a copy. And then he began typing something else." She rose then. Her hands trembled. "I didn't kill him. But I didn't stop it either. I told Charles that night. I told him everything Tilling knew." Miss Marple's voice was barely a whisper. "And in the morning, the butler was dead." Lady Greaves nodded once and left the room. Miss Marple did not follow. The false ending had unraveled. The truth, now bleeding through the cracks, had yet to reveal the final hand that delivered death. She suspected that whoever had struck would do so again, because once a lie begins to rot, it infects everything around it. And Miss Marple knew with certainty that someone in that house had just realized their secret wasn't safe anymore. The night was colder than the last, and the fog had returned, curling in over the hedges and cloaking the garden paths in silver. Miss Marple sat near the hearth in her guest room, the small scrap of scorched envelope unfolded on the side table beside her. She had pressed it flat beneath a volume of Ivanhoe, and now the faint mark of a partial address could just be made, out beneath the French stamp, Rue Mont, followed by a torn corner. It wasn't much, but it pointed to Paris, and it pointed to someone who had gone to great lengths to remain forgotten. She rose before dawn and made her way quietly to the small servants' archive tucked near the back stairs. She'd requested access under the pretext of preparing a family history for her local club, and no one had denied her the key. The cabinet drawers smelled of dust and wax, and most of the folders were brittle with time. Tilling's records were near the front. She flipped through notes in his hand, orders, inventories, rosters, and paused at a file labeled Temporary Staff, Summer 1933. That was the year Clarice had visited. A name leapt from the page, Maurice Langier, chauffeur, hired June, dismissed September, no references. A small X was marked in pencil beside his name. In Tilling's writing, she returned to the drawing room just as the household began to stir. Colonel Greaves passed her without a word. He hadn't spoken to her since Lady Greaves's admission the night before. He carried with him the weight of something unresolved, guilt perhaps, or the dread of an unraveling lie. Miss Marple suspected both. Inspector Cray returned late that morning, having been called back once Miss Marple informed him of Lady Greaves's confession. He arrived agitated, coat dusted with frost, boots heavy with mud. The chief's furious. He muttered. They wanted buried. Political donations. Society friends. The Greaves name still means something to the wrong people. But we cannot leave it, Miss Marple said softly. Not yet. There's more. She handed him the filler. Cray flipped through it, pausing at Langier's name. Not mentioned before, he said. No. But Clarice knew him. She must have. I believe he was the man with the scar. The one from Tilling's statement. Edwin's companion that summer. Quietly dismissed after Edwin's death. And then he vanished. For a while, Miss Marple said. But I suspect he didn't stay gone. I think Clarice helped him disappear. And I think he may have come back not long ago, perhaps under another name. Cray looked up sharply. You think he was in the house? I think he was near it. Perhaps not as staff but watching. And I think Clarice's reappearance, either in person or through letters, forced everything to the surface. Cray swore under his breath. We'll need more than this. Miss Marple nodded. Then look again at Martin. The boy's fear wasn't about what he saw. It was about who he recognized. I believe he saw Langier. And I believe Langier may have spoken to Tilling before he died. They called Martin to the study that afternoon. The boy arrived reluctantly, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone to appear out of the trees. When Cray mentioned the name, Maurice Langier, Martin's hands trembled. I didn't know his name, he admitted, but I saw him, a few weeks ago, in the village. He was watching the manor from across the green. Why didn't you say anything? Cray asked. Because I knew him, from the photos, old photos in the garage, from when I was sorting the tool cupboard last spring. He worked here before, but he wasn't supposed to be back. Miss Marple leaned forward. Did he speak to you? Martin swallowed. He asked if the butler still worked here. Said he had a message to deliver, that was all. Cray's jaw clenched. A message, or a warning. That evening Miss Marple walked the grounds alone. The mist had settled thickly again, and the trees creaked softly in the wind. Near the east fence past the old potting shed, she found fresh boot prints in the mud, narrow, worn soles, leading to a low wooden gate that hadn't been opened in years. She bent down and touched the latch. It moved freely, and the old lock had been oiled recently. She looked up slowly and turned her gaze back toward the house. In the drawing room, the fire was lit. Lady Greaves sat near it, reading, quietly. The curtains were pulled back just enough to frame her. For a moment, her head lifted, as if sensing something. Then she looked back to her book. Miss Marple returned indoors and asked to see the family photo albums. She claimed it was for her scrapbook. No one objected. She turned the pages slowly until she found the photo she had hoped for. Edwin standing beside a tall man in a driver's cap, face half turned, a faint white mark visible beneath his left ear. The caption below simply read, Edwin and chauffeur, summer 33. Miss Marple brought the album to Cray that night. Langier was more than Edwin's driver. I believe he was his lover. And I believe Edwin planned to leave with him. That's why the family tried to stop him. The sedative, the confrontation, it wasn't just about inheritance or public disgrace. It was personal. And when Edwin died, Langier vanished, but not forever. He returned. And he found Clarice, or she found him. Cray stared at the photo. So he came back, found Tilling, demanded answers, and then, Miss Marple said, someone killed Tilling before the truth could be passed on. But who? Langier. Miss Marple shook her head. No. Langier had no reason to silence Tilling. He needed him. I think Tilling gave him the copy of the letter. I think Langier threatened to expose everything. And I think someone else, someone with more to lose, acted first. Cray rubbed his eyes. We still don't know who. We will, Miss Marple said calmly, because whoever it is believes they've won, but they haven't realized the past has already resurfaced, and Langier may still be near. And if he is? Miss Marple looked toward the darkened garden. Then he's waiting, not for justice perhaps, but for vengeance, and I fear he won't wait much longer. The next morning broke damp and grey, the fog reluctant to lift, clinging to the hedges like old secrets. Inside St. Giles Manor, breakfast was served with its usual quiet formality, but beneath the clink of cutlery and murmured pleasantries, something had shifted. Lady Greaves wore a pale scarf despite the warmth of the room. Colonel Greaves was unusually still. Martin's eyes avoided everyone's. Even Mrs. Randall, usually brisk and composed, fumbled the silver tray when refilling the tea. No one mentioned Maurice Laugier, but the air bristled with the sense that someone might. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, took her tea in the conservatory, a habit she'd cultivated when she wanted others to believe she'd removed herself from the center of things. She sat surrounded by pale orchids and overgrown ivy, yet her mind was anything but tranquil. She had come to believe the final truth was closer than anyone realized, but logic alone wouldn't pry it loose. Not now. The guilty party was too careful, too composed. They would not be caught by questioning or suspicion. What she needed was reaction. So she devised a small experiment. After luncheon, she sent word through Mrs. Randall that she'd found an old journal in the servants' quarters, something belonging to Mr. Tilling, and that she would be bringing it to Inspector Cray in the evening. The message, spoken casually and with just the right note of gossip, was guaranteed to reach the ears of everyone in the household within the hour. And Miss Marple made certain to be seen holding a small book wrapped in cloth, which she placed quite deliberately on the side table in the drawing-room as she took up her knitting. She waited. Within 30 minutes, Martin passed through the all twice, each time glancing at the table. The colonel emerged from his study and paused near the door, his eyes flicking toward the cloth bundle. Lady Greaves didn't come at all, but Mrs. Randall did. She entered on the pretense of adjusting the fire, stayed a moment too long, then asked Miss Marple if she'd like her tea refreshed. Miss Marple declined, thanked her, and left the room shortly afterward, murmuring something vague about needing her shawl. She returned silently 5 minutes later and found Mrs. Randall alone in the room, her back turned to the door, one hand inside the cloth-wrapped parcel. She startled when Miss Marple cleared her throat. "Oh, I didn't know you'd come back," Mrs. Randall said too quickly. "I left my knitting," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I see it's not quite where I left it." The housekeeper straightened. "I was only checking. It looked like something that shouldn't be left out." "Of course," Miss Marple said, entirely understandable. But she noticed, with precise attention, the faint tremor in Mrs. Randall's hands, and the way her eyes darted to the hearth before settling back on Miss Marple's face. That brief, silent calculation, whether she'd been seen, whether to admit or deflect, was the first true fracture in the woman's otherwise faultless composure. Miss Marple knew then that Mrs. Randall had not only suspected what the cloth bundle might contain, she had feared it. Later that day, Miss Marple took Inspector Cray aside. She thought it was the real journal, she said. She risked herself to see it. Which means she knows or believes that whatever was written in it could harm her. But why? Cray asked. What would she have to do with Edwin's death? Perhaps nothing, Miss Marple said. But with Tillings, possibly everything. She would have been the one to handle his correspondence, see who came and went, who sent letters, who received them. Cray's eyes narrowed. You think she intercepted Clarice's letter? Or perhaps delivered it directly into the wrong hands? They confronted her that evening, not with accusations but with silence. Cray simply placed a blank notebook on the table in front of her and said, "You already looked inside. Now tell us what you expected to find." Mrs. Randall didn't deny it. She sat down slowly, her eyes on the book. "I thought he'd written it all down," she said at last. "That he'd made a record. Names, dates, what he knew." "Because you were afraid of what he might have said about you?" Cray asked. She shook her head. "Because I already knew what he'd written in the letter to Lady Greaves." Miss Marple leaned forward. Then you read it before she did. Yes, she said quietly. I opened it. I knew it would come to her and I couldn't risk it. Not because of myself, but because of him. She looked at Cray. The Colonel. There was a long silence. He killed Tilling, Cray asked. No, she said. But he told me to intercept the letter. He said the family couldn't survive. Another scandal, said it was only a warning, not proof. He begged me to burn it before she saw it. But she already had. She lied to him. Told him it was gone. And you believed him? Miss Marple asked softly. I wanted to. I've served this house nearly 30 years. I thought if I destroyed the only evidence it would end there. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. But it didn't. Because someone else knew. Langier. Mrs. Randall nodded. He came to the kitchen door. Asked to see Tilling. I told him to wait. But the Colonel had seen him. And that night, the butler was found dead. Cray's voice was low. You're saying Colonel Greaves killed him? Mrs. Randall hesitated. I don't know. But I heard voices from the library. Just before dawn, 2 men arguing, then silence. When I looked in later that morning, Tilling was dead. Why not say something then? I was afraid. And by the time I thought better of it, it was too late. Miss Marple rose slowly. Then we must ask the Colonel again, but differently, this time. They waited until the house quieted. Miss Marple, with her usual tact, requested a private moment with the Colonel. She found him in the study, brandy untouched on the sideboard, staring out at the fog. I lied to protect her, he said before she spoke. Clarice. She came to me first, not my wife. Said she had proof. Said she wanted money. I gave her enough to leave. I thought she had. But she came back again. Found Tilling. Did you kill him? He turned. No. But I confronted him. I was angry. He said it was too late to stop anything. That Morris had a copy, that he would send it to the papers. I may have threatened him. But I left him alive. Miss Marple watched him carefully. And you told your wife? I told her everything. That's when she said she'd already read the letter. That she'd burned it. Miss Marple studied the man's face. His hands were steady, his voice even. But there was something missing. Fear. She left him there and rejoined Cray. He didn't do it, she said quietly. Then who did? Miss Marple looked down at the false journal still resting on the table. The person who believed the letter still existed, who feared exposure, who watched me carry that parcel and couldn't resist looking inside. Cray's brow furrowed. Randall? No, Miss Marple said softly. She feared what others had done. But someone else acted to protect themselves and made one fatal mistake. She turned toward the staircase toward the upper wing of the house. She knew the fire in the library hadn't burned the whole letter, because she was the one who tried to destroy it. The second time. The next morning dawned grey again, as though the house itself had settled under a layer of dread. The drawing room was quiet, the usual rattle of silverware and murmured good mornings noticeably subdued. The staff moved slower. Even the ticking of the hall clock seemed louder. Inspector Cray had barely touched his tea, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, sat near the window with her knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes not on the yarn, but on the staircase. It had been Lady Greaves, she was now sure. The fire in the grate had failed to burn the letter completely. Only someone who had returned to the room afterward, someone desperate, would have seen that a fragment remained, enough to incriminate her, enough to make her act again. Miss Marple waited until the house settled, then rose quietly and made her way to the library. She had hidden the burnt scrap of envelope in the back of a hollowed-out book on the third shelf. The Woman in White, by Wilkie Collins, of all things, a book whose spine hadn't been opened in years. But as she reached for it, Her hand met empty space. The book was gone. She stepped back slowly, her heart not panicked, but weighted with certainty. She checked the other books along the shelf, even the ones similar in size and cover. None had been disturbed. The hollow book had been taken. Not by chance. Someone had known exactly where to look. She didn't report it at once. Instead, she walked calmly back down the corridor, stopping by the small writing desk in the alcove near the back stairs. A drawer had been left open, slightly askew. Inside were scattered envelopes, some torn, some empty. One bore a faint circular ash stain along the corner, as though a wax seal had burned too long. She lifted it gently. It matched the French postmark. It had not been destroyed entirely. Someone had removed it, then replaced it, perhaps hoping it would go unnoticed. But they had taken the real evidence, the charred fragment from the fireplace that had never belonged to any envelope, the one that had been tucked in, the woman in white. When she returned to the drawing room, Cray was pacing. "Langier's been spotted," he said abruptly. "One of the groundskeepers saw someone matching his description near the north hedgerow at dawn. But by the time we got there, he was gone. Then he's waiting for something," Miss Marple said. "Or someone." Cray frowned. "And now we have no proof that he ever received the copy of the letter. No way to know what he holds." "We had proof," Miss Marple replied. "I hid it. It's been taken." Cray turned sharply. "Who else knew where it was?" "No one," she said. "Which is what troubles me. The thief didn't stumble across it. They sought it. Then we have a traitor, or someone more desperate than we realized. They both knew there weren't many who fit that category anymore. Martin, perhaps, but he was too young, too nervous. Hurst had been dismissed. The colonel, though complicit, had reached the end of his defiance. But Lady Greaves, she still moved with the cold precision of a woman trying to preserve something. Not innocence, but legacy. Cray ordered a quiet search of the house. No announcements, no alarm. A few trusted officers arrived under the pretense of inspecting the property. They checked bins, fireplaces, drawers. Nothing. Not a trace of the book, nor the fragment it once held. By mid-afternoon, it was clear the evidence had either been destroyed or taken far beyond the reach of the manor. At dusk, Miss Marple took a walk along the path leading behind the greenhouse, where the soil had been recently turned. The gardener's apprentice had mentioned seeing strange footprints the day before, thin, worn soles like those Langier would wear. She followed the path until it narrowed near the east gate. There, beneath a patch of ivy, she noticed something new. A small, carefully dug hole, recently refilled. She knelt down, brushing the dirt away with a handkerchief, and unearthed a length of black ribbon, the kind used to tie legal papers or sealed letters. It was damp, muddied, and frayed at the edge, as though it had been hastily torn off. Nothing else remained. She didn't disturb it further. She returned to the manor and told Cray. "They're hiding something still," she said. "Not just from us, but from him." "You think Langier is the real target now?" "I think Langier is dangerous to the wrong person. And they're trying to reach him before we do." That evening the household was quiet again. Dinner was strained. Colonel Greaves remained in his study. Lady Greaves claimed a headache and retired early. Mrs. Randall was silent. Martin lingered in the hallway, then disappeared altogether. Miss Marple sat with her knitting and said nothing. At 10 o'clock, a sound stirred the hush. Not a crash, just the faintest creak of hinges. Cray emerged from his room and crossed to the study, Miss Marple following behind him. The lock had been tampered with, scratched around the keyhole. Inside, the desk drawers had been pulled open. The safe stood slightly ajar. Cray opened it fully. "Nothing's been taken," he muttered. "But someone's looking for something, or making sure it's gone, or planting something, Miss Marple said. He paused. You believe they're turning the case? I believe someone is setting up Langier. If he's found now, it will be as a scapegoat, not a witness. Miss Marple turned her attention to the fire. A small log burned low, barely enough to warm the room. She stepped closer and reached into the ash pan. Nestled among the grey flakes was something blackened and twisted, part of a photograph. She lifted it carefully. It showed a man in profile, faintly visible, standing near a car. The collar of his coat, high and sharp, looked too modern for the photograph's supposed age. This wasn't Tilling's doing, she said. This was someone trying to erase the last connection. Cray took the fragment and sighed. We're losing ground. Miss Marple looked toward the stairs. Then we must make them think they've won. Cray turned. How? Announce tomorrow that we're closing the investigation, that the matter is being handed to London, that no further inquiries will be made at the manor. Why? So they'll stop hiding and act. Cray nodded slowly. We're baiting them. We're giving them what they want, Miss Marple said. False security. If the real criminal believes the danger has passed, they'll let something slip, and when they do, we'll be watching. Cray met her eyes. And if they strike first? Miss Marple folded her hands. Then we'll be ready. By morning, the mood in the house had shifted again. The announcement, issued quietly but with firm finality, had been delivered over breakfast. The inquiry into Mr. Tilling's death was officially closed, and all remaining questions were to be deferred to the Metropolitan authorities. Inspector Cray spoke the words with deliberate resignation, ensuring they landed not with drama, but with calculated relief. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the fireplace with her shawl drawn close, did not look up when Lady Greaves sat down, her teacup a touch too quickly, or when Martin visibly exhaled as if a weight had been lifted from his narrow shoulders. She was watching not faces but the hands, who clenched their napkin, who held their fork too tightly, who dared glance toward the windows. The criminal among them wasn't comforted. They were recalculating. Cray lingered after breakfast, pacing the drawing room with a kind of constrained energy. They believe it, he said, barely above a whisper. At least some of them. They believe what they want to believe, Miss Marple murmured. But belief doesn't stop fear. It simply hides it. She returned to the conservatory for her knitting, ensuring her visibility as Cray made his show of packing his notes and retiring to the village station for the day. A trap, carefully baited. The bait wasn't the case, it was absence, authority stepping aside, a silent permission for someone to act freely. The real evidence had been destroyed or buried. The only danger left to the criminal now was the possibility of a witness. And Miss Marple knew exactly who that was. By late afternoon, the weather had turned again. A fine mist darkened the garden paths and the sky wore the flat pallor of early dusk. Miss Marple noticed it first in the rhythm of the house. The cook's assistant murmuring about missing linen, a tray left untouched in the upper wing, and Martin nowhere to be found. Not in the garage, not in the kitchen, not in the gatehouse, where he sometimes sneaked cigarettes behind the ivy wall. She sent a discreet request through Mrs. Randall. No one had seen him since the early morning. Cray was recalled immediately. They searched the grounds before nightfall. By torchlight, by lamplight, they swept the perimeter, the stables, the hedgerows, calling his name. A discarded satchel was found behind the greenhouse, empty, but for a rusted penknife and a crushed box of matches. Then, near the eastern boundary wall, where the ivy grew thick and the ground was soft with recent rain, Martin's boot was discovered, half buried, as if torn off mid-struggle. The laces were snapped. Cray knelt beside it and pressed his palm into the soil. Still warm. The boy had been taken, or had run in desperation, and not long ago. Langier, Cray muttered. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, or perhaps someone wants it to look like him. An hour later, a cry rang out from the library. Mrs. Randall had gone to tidy the fire and found the door ajar, the room in disarray. A single candlestick lay on the floor, and the window latch had been snapped. But more startling, on the desk, untouched but unmistakable, was a note in jagged, unfamiliar handwriting. "I warned you. The next one won't be so lucky." Cray read it twice, then handed it to Miss Marple, who scanned it silently, then shook her head. This was written in haste. See how the ink pools at the end of the Y? No time to blot, and the paper, note the watermark, it's not from the house. "A plant?" Cray asked. "A diversion," she said. "Someone wants us to look outward, to search the hedges again. But whoever left this was inside not an hour ago, and Martin was taken by someone who knew exactly where he would be." Cray turned to the constables. "Double the watch at the gates. No one in or out without my order." Miss Marple walked to the fireplace. The ashpan had not been cleaned. She stirred it gently with the poker and found, nestled at the edge, the curled remains of a photograph. Not the one from the night before. This one had a different tier, a white sliver across the top. She recognized the edge. She had seen it in one of the albums. It had been the second photo of Edwin and Langier, taken by the old stone bridge. That album had vanished from the drawing room table just yesterday. "Someone's trying to erase more than evidence," she said. "They're erasing memory." Cray's voice grew sharper. "So who's left that has motive, means, and desperation?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Someone who needs the lie to remain intact. Not just to protect the past, but because if the truth comes out, everything they've built will collapse." They called the household together. Lady Greaves descended the staircase with regal calm, her hair pinned perfectly in place, not a single thread of disorder in her pale blouse. The Colonel followed slowly, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Mrs. Randall stood stiff and silent at the back. Cray explained the situation with minimal flourish. Martin missing, a note found, and a likely second crime unfolding in real time. The air went still. No one spoke. Miss Marple stepped forward. "We believe someone in this house knows where Martin is, or knows who took him." No one moved. She turned to Lady Greaves. "Do you?" Lady Greaves lifted her chin. "I've no idea where that boy is," but her voice cracked. Barely. Enough that Colonel Greaves shifted, just perceptibly, his brow drawn. Miss Marple looked at him next. "You said you threatened Tilling, but didn't harm him. You said you told your wife everything." He nodded slowly. "Did she tell you everything in return?" His gaze faltered. Lady Greaves turned sharply. "This is absurd." Miss Marple was calm. Clarice was never the threat. She had already lost her brother. Langier was never the threat. He had already lost the man he loved. Tilling was not the threat. He had only his principles. But Martin saw something. Maybe he overheard your argument. Maybe he caught a glimpse of the person leaving the library that night. Maybe he knew what was hidden in the desk before it was burned. And that made him dangerous. Because unlike the rest, he had no reason to lie. Cray's voice was hard. "Where is he?" But Lady Greaves said nothing. Her hands trembled now, just slightly. Then she turned and walked out. Cray moved, but Miss Marple held his arm. "Wait." Footsteps echoed on the stairs above. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then a door slammed. Cray rushed to follow, reaching the upper floor in time to see the small attic corridor swing open. Inside, in the narrow space behind the linen trunks, Martin sat on a wooden chair, gagged but alive, pale, eyes wide, and beside him, tied loosely to a bed frame, lay a bundle. The hollow book, the woman in white, its spine now slit, its pages missing. In its place, beneath the cords, a photograph half torn, and a second note scrawled hastily. He saw her face. He knew. They cut the ropes and carried the boy down, dazed, but unharmed. He couldn't name his captor. Only said a voice had told him, "You'll be safe until morning, if they stop asking questions." But Miss Marple already knew. Someone had tried to silence the past, but now the present was louder, and they were running out of places to hide. The attic had been sealed, the boy taken into care, and seen by the physician. And yet the house remained, wound tight in silence. No one was arrested, no names were spoken aloud. But every footstep down the corridor, every click of a door latch, carried the weight of what had just occurred. Miss Marple sat quietly near the staircase with her hands folded and her knitting untouched beside her. It wasn't over, not yet. Something still didn't fit. And that was what bothered her most. The rope, the chair, the hidden attic space, they had all been hurried, crude, improvised. Not the work of someone with the foresight and control that had marked every other move in this case. The earlier crimes had been precise. Tilling's death, the destroyed letter, even the planted photograph. In the fire, all signs of a mind working ahead of its pursuers. But this had been clumsy, reactive, someone trying to fix something that was already slipping beyond their grasp. Inspector Cray was pacing again, tired of being a step behind. "We know it's someone inside this house," he said for the third time that morning. Martin must have seen them, perhaps not directly, but enough to recognize something, a voice, a smell, a gesture. Miss Marple sipped her tea and stared into the fire. And perhaps it wasn't what he saw, but what he didn't. We've been watching everyone move about this house, yet someone is always in the background, always present, but never truly seen. Cray looked over sharply. "You mean Randall?" "She has secrets, yes," Miss Marple said. "But she is loyal, deeply, dangerously. She burned a letter to protect the family, not herself. That's a different kind of lie. And she would never harm the boy." Cray rubbed the side of his face. "Then who?" Miss Marple reached for her knitting, not to begin but to think. The pattern was familiar, something delicate, something slow, something patient. She had been working the same pair of socks for days, but had started over more than once because a single stitch had gone wrong. It always started that way, something small, almost invisible, and then it built quietly, until the whole thing collapsed if left uncorrected. Her eyes drifted toward the library, and suddenly it came back to her. It wasn't a moment of drama or some grand epiphany. It was an offhand comment from days before, buried among the others, something Mrs. Randall had said when speaking of the night of the butler's death. There was a name at the top, she'd whispered, but I only caught a glance. It wasn't hers. I think it said Edwin. But the letter had been addressed to Lady Greaves. Tilling had written her name on the envelope himself. Why would the name Edwin be at the top of the actual letter? Miss Marple stood up abruptly. "We've been wrong about the intended recipient." Cray frowned. "You think he didn't write the letter to Lady Greaves?" "He addressed the envelope to her," she said. "But the letter inside began with Edwin's name. It was not a confession. It was not a warning. It was a statement meant for someone else entirely." Cray straightened. "But Edwin was already dead." "Yes." "Which means it wasn't a letter. It was a copy." "A copy of what?" "Of a letter Edwin himself had written, perhaps years ago before his death. And Tilling had found it. Or had kept it. Perhaps hidden by Clarice, perhaps given to him by Lungier. But he transcribed it, perhaps typed it to preserve it, and intended to deliver it to the person who most feared it." Cray blinked. "Then everything we've been chasing, Tilling's murder, the stolen photo, the destroyed letter, it's all about this one document, a letter Edwin wrote before he died. And Miss Marple said softly. Who in this house would fear such a letter more than anyone? The silence stretched. Not Lady Greaves. She had already confessed to withholding the truth. Not Colonel Greaves. His guilt had long ago settled into resignation. Not Randall, not Martin, not Loungier. No. There was one person who had never once been questioned, never once suspected, never once considered capable. Miss Marple walked quietly to the upper wing, where the guest bedrooms lined the corridor like watching eyes. She paused before the smallest of them and knocked gently. The door opened. Clarice. She had returned under another name. Miss Layton, a cousin, assisting Lady Greaves with correspondence. A role invented, accepted, and never examined too closely. Her hair was darker now, her posture straighter. But the sharpness of her gaze had not dulled. She met Miss Marple's eyes without flinching. You always knew, Clarice said simply. Not always, Miss Marple replied, but once Martin vanished, I began to consider who had the freedom to move between staff and family, who could listen to both sides, who had access to the attic, and who had the greatest reason to keep Edwin's final words buried. Clarice stepped back and let her in. The room was neat, modest. A small suitcase lay packed on the bed. Miss Marple saw it without comment. I never meant for anyone to be hurt, Clarice said. Not the boy, not Charles, but the letter. It would have destroyed everything. Was it true? Miss Marple asked. Clarice nodded. Edwin knew. About the finances, about the affair, about the arrangement with the inspector. He was going to expose it all. He wasn't reckless. He was angry. So they drugged him, not to kill him, just to stop him. But it killed him anyway. Yes, and I stayed quiet. I left the country, but when Langer found me last year, I knew it was only a matter of time. So I came back. I thought if I could control the story, keep the copy of the letter out of sight, I could manage it. But Tilling wouldn't listen. He believed in duty. So you killed him. Clarice looked away. No, I argued with him. But I left him alive. I thought he was bluffing about the copy. But someone else found it. I don't know who. I only know that the night after I burned the original, someone came into my room and took the ash remains from my fireplace. Miss Marple studied her. Then the person we're looking for still hasn't been caught. Still hasn't been named. Clarice's voice dropped. And they're still trying to make me the villain. Outside in the corridor, a soft footfall, echoed and faded. Miss Marple turned toward the window. A shadow moved past the rose trellis and disappeared beyond the hedge. The pattern had formed. The key had been there all along, not in what had been said, but in what had been copied, and someone was still trying to erase the original. Clarice's confession had shifted the entire balance of the case, but not in the way Miss Marple had anticipated. It was not guilt that weighed on her. It was fear. Fear not of being discovered, but of being blamed for something she hadn't done. And that distinction mattered, because it meant the true culprit was still out there, still watching, still silencing pieces of the past as they surfaced. Miss Marple left the room quietly, her mind already 2 steps ahead. The shadow she'd glimpsed outside the window hadn't been Clarice. It had been someone using her return as cover, someone who had worked diligently to keep all eyes on her, while they moved without suspicion. She descended the staircase slowly, each tread giving her time to think. Tilling had not been murdered over a simple letter or a scandal from the past. The panic, the destruction, the abduction of Martin, these were not the marks of someone guarding an old secret. They were the signs of someone desperate to prevent something new from being discovered. Someone whose present was built entirely on a lie rooted in Edwin's death. Inspector Cray stood in the library when she arrived, his arms folded tightly as if to brace himself. Well, he asked. She didn't kill Tilling, Miss Marple said. She burned the letter. She tried to keep control of the narrative, yes, but she didn't strike the blow. Cray exhaled. Then who did? Miss Marple walked to the desk and sat, folding her hands. We've been too focused on Edwin's letter as a confession. But what if it wasn't one? What if it was an accusation? One Edwin wrote not to expose a family scandal but to warn someone. Cray furrowed his brow. Warn who? Miss Marple tilted her head. Who would Edwin have written to if he'd learned that someone in the house wasn't who they claimed to be? Someone impersonating a name, perhaps. Using influence to remain close to the family without ever revealing their true identity. Cray went still. You don't mean Clarice? No. I mean someone who used Clarice's disappearance to their advantage. A silence passed between them before Miss Marple continued. Let's return to the photograph, the one Tilling tried to preserve, the one of Edwin and the chauffeur, Langier. We assumed it was Langier because of the scar. But what if the man in the photograph wasn't Langier at all? What if it was someone else? Someone who had been close to Edwin, close enough to fool us all. Cray stared at her. Someone pretending to be Langier. Yes, Miss Marple said. Or rather, someone who took his place, stole his name, his identity. After Edwin's death, Langier vanished. The real Langier may never have returned, but someone else did. Someone who needed to stay close to this house to erase the last traces of what Edwin had uncovered. Cray's face hardened. Who? A quiet voice came from the door. Me. They turned. Colonel Greaves stood there, a strange stillness in his face, not resignation, not fear, something closer to relief. I wondered how long it would take, he said quietly. I always knew Edwin was going to destroy everything, but I never thought it would take him 10 years to do it from the grave. Miss Marple stood but did not interrupt. She watched him carefully as he stepped into the room, not as a man cornered, but as a man ready to tell a story he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. You've all been so busy with the letter, the fire, the photographs. But none of it would have mattered if Tilling had minded his place. He was loyal to Edwin to the last. Even after death, he protected that boy's secrets. He never understood what it would do to this family. What he would do. Cray's voice was low. What exactly did Edwin discover? The colonel looked at the desk, his hands clasped behind his back. He found out that the real Langier was a fraud. Not just a lover, not just a scandal, but someone using him. He had come under a false identity posing as a chauffeur, but digging into the family finances, the land deeds, even the trust holdings. He was trying to manipulate Edwin into signing over power of attorney. Edwin found out, and instead of going to the police, he confronted him. Langier didn't take it. Well, he threatened to ruin everything. Miss Marple's voice was calm. But Langier didn't kill Edwin. No, the colonel said. I did. The room was silent. I didn't mean to. I only meant to drug him, to calm him down, stop him from leaving the estate and shouting accusations. He was in the drawing room, trembling with rage. I slipped the sedative into his glass. He passed out. The next morning, he was dead. And Langier? Cray asked. He fled, took what he could and ran. But it wasn't long before I discovered what Edwin had written. A letter hidden in his desk drawer. Tilling found it later, kept it, protected it. So when Clarice returned, Miss Marple said, You saw your past about to collapse. Yes, the colonel said. She had nothing to do with Edwin's death. But her presence, her face, her history, was a threat. She started asking questions. That's when Tilling began acting strangely. Then Langier returned, or so I thought, but I was wrong. He laughed once bitterly. It wasn't Langier, it was someone else, someone pretending. A man who called himself Maurice. He came to me and said he wanted justice. I paid him to leave. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't, Miss Marple said softly. He came back. And this time, he found Martin. The colonel's jaw tensed. The boy saw him near the greenhouse. He told Tilling. That was the beginning of the end. Tilling threatened to go to the authorities, said if I didn't come forward he would, so I came forward. With a poker, Cray said grimly. The colonel looked up, eyes steady. I didn't mean to kill him. I told him to hand over the letter. He refused. We argued. He grabbed my wrist. I struck him without thinking. Once. He fell. I left him slumped in the chair, locked the door, and then tried to erase him, Miss Marple said. The letter, the photographs, the photograph album. All of it. He nodded. If it had ended there, I might have escaped it. But Martin found the photograph again. He told Clarice, and she told Randall. It was all unraveling. Cray moved toward him. You kidnapped the boy, hid him in the attic, left a note to frame Langier. I had no choice, the colonel said. He would have ruined everything. The estate, the name, the only thing that still held meaning in this house. Miss Marple stepped forward. So it wasn't about Edwin's death. Not truly. It was about control. And your need to preserve something long rotted. He looked at her, weary but unflinching. Yes. Cray took him by the arm. The colonel offered no resistance. As he was led out, the room felt strangely quiet again, as if the air itself had exhaled. Miss Marple stood by the fire and finally picked up her knitting. The pattern had always been there, threads hidden behind threads, but it took seeing the wrong stitch repeated to notice what had been disguised from the start. Not revenge, not money, but legacy. A man willing to kill to protect an illusion he had built around a lie. And now at last, the house could breathe again. The corridors of St. Giles Manor had never been quieter. After Colonel Greaves was taken into custody, the house seemed suspended, in a strange stillness like breath held too long. Yet Miss Marple felt none of the relief that should have followed a confession. The colonel's crimes were real, his guilt undeniable, but her mind remained unsettled. His admission had been too neat, too composed, as though he had stepped into a role he had practiced in private. But real guilt, as she had seen it time and again, rarely presented so cleanly. It unraveled slowly, painfully, with contradictions and shame. The colonel had shown neither. She spent the rest of the evening in her room knitting and unraveling the same row. The stitches felt too uniform, like the story that had just been told. Something had been left out. A thread cut just before it frayed. At dawn she walked alone through the gardens. The dew clung to her shoes, and the hedges loomed like sleeping sentries. Near the east gate she paused. Something had changed. A patch of ivy had been cleared recently and deliberately. She stepped closer, brushing it aside. There, tucked behind the stones, was a cigarette tin. Inside, a half-charred envelope, scorched just enough to destroy a name. At the corner was marked with a crest, not from the Greaves household, but from a solicitor's office in London. Miss Marple carried it back to the house and knocked on Clarice's door. The woman answered quickly, already dressed, her suitcase gone from the bed, but her eyes sharp with exhaustion. I need to ask you one last question, Miss Marple said softly. About the night Martin disappeared. Clarice opened the door, wider. Yes? Where were you between 8 and 10? Clarice hesitated. I was in the upstairs study, writing letters. And did anyone see you? She shook her head. No. Miss Marple held up the tin. This was found by the east wall. The boy didn't hide it. Someone planted it. Someone who wanted the search to turn in the wrong direction. You told me you burned Edwin's letter, but this isn't the one you burned. Clarice stepped back slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Then who burned this one? That's what I've come to ask. Downstairs, Inspector Cray was poring over the colonel's signed confession. It fits, he said. He had access, he had motive, and he admitted to it. He admitted to a version of it, Miss Marple replied. A version designed to close the case neatly. Cray frowned. You don't believe him. I believe he covered up Edwin's death, but he didn't kill Tilling. Nor did he hide Martin. The timeline doesn't hold. Cray looked at her carefully. Then who? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the ash-filled tin and opened it again. This was planted by someone who knew exactly what the original letter looked like and how to make a false version resemble it. Cray's eyes narrowed. Forgery. Yes, she said. And there's only one person here who's had unrestricted access to correspondence, to the study, to the fire, to every drawer in the house for decades. It took Cray a full second. Randall. They found her in the kitchen, wiping down the silver with practiced precision. She didn't flinch when Cray stepped in. Back for another round, are we? Miss Marple set the tin down on the table beside her. You've been protecting this family longer than anyone, but this wasn't about loyalty, was it? Mrs. Randall paused, just for a breath, then resumed polishing. You're reaching. You forged the second letter. You made sure it was found, half-burned, to shift suspicion toward Clarice. You watched the Colonel sink beneath the weight of guilt, and you let him confess, because it would bury the truth once and for all. Mrs. Randall's voice remained calm. You have no proof. I have a pattern, Miss Marple said. You intercepted letters. You knew where Tilling kept his papers. You knew about Martin overhearing voices and tried to shut him away before he could repeat them. The attic, the rope, the notes, too careful, too measured. It wasn't a panic. It was a strategy. Mrs. Randall didn't speak. Her hands had stopped moving. You blamed Clarice because she threatened the structure. But it was never Clarice who cost you everything. It was Edwin. Slowly the housekeeper lowered the cloth. Her face was expressionless, but her voice cracked when she spoke. He was going to ruin the Colonel, turn the family into a scandal. That boy thought truth meant something, but truth destroys things. Miss Marple nodded gently. You loved him. Her shoulders tightened. Not in any way he would have returned, but yes. I served this house for 37 years. I watched it survive wars, debts, affairs, but Edwin was going to drag it into the mud, and for what? So he could feel righteous. So you protected the family? No, she said. I protected what was left of it. I protected what I gave my life to. Cray stepped forward. You struck Tilling. She nodded. He wouldn't stop. He said it wasn't his place to keep secrets. Said if the Colonel wouldn't speak, he would. I told him he didn't understand what it would do to this house. He said he didn't care. I only meant to scare him. But I hit him harder than I thought. And Martin. She shook her head. He was just in the wrong place. I needed time. I couldn't risk him saying something too soon. Miss Marple's voice was low. And the Colonel? I never told him. He assumed it was himself. I let him. It was better that way. He'd already buried Edwin. Let him bury this too. For a long moment no one moved. Cray gave the slightest nod to the constable behind him. Mrs. Randall stood silently as the cuffs were placed on her wrists. Miss Marple remained still. Her eyes followed Randall as she was led from the room. Not in triumph, not in pity, but in understanding. Some crimes are committed for greed, some for hatred, but the worst, she knew, are committed in the name of devotion. Because the line between love and destruction, when walked too long, becomes invisible. And now at last the line had been seen. Even as the manor exhaled the tension it had held for so long, doors creaking open again, voices returning to a murmur instead of a whisper, Miss Marple felt no relief. Mrs. Randall's arrest had brought the illusion of closure, but not the certainty of it. The timing, the motive, the method, they all fit. Too well, in fact. And it was that very neatness that unsettled her. The crime, as confessed, had been an act of desperation from a woman drowning in misplaced loyalty. Yet the measures taken in the days surrounding Tilling's death had not been the work of desperation. They had been cold, deliberate, calculated. Miss Marple returned to the attic that afternoon, retracing her steps not to search but to feel. The rope that bound Martin had been tied with a sailor's precision. The knot type, constrictor, knot, clove, was used to hold firm under pressure. She'd seen it once before in a photograph of Edwin's boyhood. He and his friend by a mooring, one of them demonstrating knot tying with laughing precision. Edwin had been proud of his sailing skills, but his friend, whose face was turned slightly from the camera, was the one demonstrating the knot. The thread, frayed and discarded, pulled tight again. She asked to see the album a final time. The one where the photos had been pulled, replaced, or burned. Most pages were intact, but one photo pasted beside the one of Edwin and Lungier had been sloppily reattached, the glue still fresh. A name had been scratched from the caption beneath. She held it up to the light, angled the paper, and the ghost of the name emerged. Edward, Greaves, and Christopher. The rest torn away. Edward, not Edwin. Her hand stilled. The name had never been mentioned. The family never spoke of any other brother. But there had been one. The older Greaves' son. Sent abroad after a nervous episode. Institutionalized, she now recalled for reasons never explained. And then quietly erased from public life. She went to the study where Cray was finalizing the report. Edward Greaves, she said quietly. Did you know there were two sons? Cray looked up slowly. I thought Edwin was the only one. So did I, she said. Until just now. But there was an elder brother, the forgotten one. Disinherited perhaps, or removed. Whatever happened, he vanished before Edwin's death. But he's back. He's been back. Cray set his pen down. You think he killed Tilling? I think he orchestrated it, and let Randall take the fall. But where is he? How could he remain hidden? Miss Marple paused. By not hiding at all. She turned toward the east wing. There's one man who's been quietly present. Since the beginning. Not as family, not as staff, but as someone always in the background. Cray followed her down the hall, through the narrow corridor that led to the gardener's quarters. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was clean, orderly. The bed neatly made, the boots by the wall perfectly aligned. But something was off. Too clean, too quiet, too prepared. Cray opened the small desk. Inside was a passport, British. Issued under the name Charles Redford, a name no one in the household recognized. But the photograph inside matched the man they knew as Hurst, the gardener. Cray stared. That's not his name. Miss Marple opened the drawer beside it. Inside was a faded photograph. Two boys on a dock, one holding a rope, one laughing. Edward and Edwin. And in the corner, scrawled in what looked like a boy's hand, was a single word. Brothers. He never left, Miss Marple said. Edward Greaves disappeared from society, yes, but he came back under another name. Hurst was not a servant. He was a Greaves, hidden in plain sight, perhaps brought back under quiet arrangements, or perhaps he returned on his own terms. Either way, he watched everything unfold from the gardens. Cray stepped back. Then he was the one Martin saw that night. And the one who forged the letters, Miss Marple said. He had the skill. He had the motive. Edwin's letter, if it was a warning, was aimed at him. Edwin must have learned his brother had returned and was meddling again. Perhaps he even planned to expose him, knowing the instability Edward had shown before. But before he could act, Edward silenced him. The same way he later silenced Tilling and manipulated Mrs. Randall into taking the blame. They returned to the main house at once, but Hurst was gone, his quarters empty, his coat missing. At the gate, a groundskeeper reported seeing him leave just after sunrise, carrying a small case. Said he was heading toward the village for a tool order. Cray issued the alert within minutes. 2 hours later, they found the abandoned case near the railway line. Inside was a train ticket to Dover, torn and unused. Beside it, a burned envelope. The same solicitor crest, but no Edward Greaves. Cray stood over the bag and exhaled sharply. He planned this, right down to the escape. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. He always had time to plan, years of it. But why now? Because Edwin's letter survived, and it named him. Tilling found it. Randall saw it. Clarice remembered him. He had too many eyes turning toward him. So he tied off each thread until one slipped. Cray kicked at the gravel. And now he's gone. For now, Miss Marple said, but not forgotten. Not again. That evening she stood in the library, watching the fire burn low. The manor was returning to itself, but altered. The past had emerged not as a single truth, but as a layered deception. A house built on tradition, undone not by scandal, but by silence. And in that silence, a man had moved freely, unseen, but not anymore. She picked up her knitting once more. The pattern was complete. The light outside St. Giles Manor dimmed slowly, the last glow of day retreating beyond the hedgerows, as if reluctant to leave the house entirely in shadow. Inside, the air was still, not relieved, just hushed, as if waiting for something else to fall. Miss Marple stood at the long window of the library, her knitting untouched in the armchair behind her, and watched the wind press gently against the branches, stirring the ivy where Edward Greaves had once slipped through unnoticed. She had expected closure, or at least resolution. But the morning's discovery of the abandoned case and forged identity had left the manor with something else entirely, a wound cauterized too late. Inspector Cray entered quietly, holding a telegram. No sightings at Dover. They believe he never boarded. The ferry office has no record. He must have changed direction, possibly inland. Miss Marple didn't turn from the window. He was always clever that way, letting others believe he'd gone left while he slipped right. That's how he stayed hidden in plain sight for all these years. Cray frowned, stepping toward the fire. Still hard to believe he pulled it off. A man like that, with a past so tangled, stepping back into this house under a new name, and no one noticed. They noticed, Miss Marple said softly. But they didn't want to see. That's how most secrets survive. Not by being buried deep, but by resting just where no one dares look. Cray sat heavily in the chair. And Randall? She knew eventually, Miss Marple said. I believe he confided in her. Or perhaps she recognized him and made her own choices. She thought she was protecting the colonel. But in the end, she was just another piece he moved on the board. Cray held up the case file, now thick with confessions, forged documents, and fragments of destroyed letters. You said there were clues all along. What did we miss? Miss Marple turned then, and her eyes held that calm gleam that came when clarity sharpened all things into their true shapes. The first clue, she said, was the knot. When Martin was found in the attic bound with a constrictor knot, I recognized it as something most gardeners wouldn't know, but sailors would. And Edwin's old photos showed that knot, tied not by him, but by the boy beside him. That boy was Edward. Cray nodded slowly. But we had no record of Edward being on the estate. Precisely, she said. That was the second clue. For a house as meticulous as this one, for a family obsessed with reputation, to leave no mention of an elder son, that silence was suspicious. Most families explain away their troubled relatives. This one erased him. Cray leaned forward. And the photos? They were altered, she said. Photos pulled, labels scraped off. But one remained, poorly, re-glued. It had once read Edward and Edwin. Someone had tried to erase Edward from even that, and when the forgery was sloppy, I knew the erasure had been hurried. That meant Edward had returned, but was not yet in full control. Cray rubbed the back of his neck. But why come back at all? To reinsert himself, Miss Marple said, at first perhaps only to observe, then to manipulate. When Edwin discovered him and began to resist, he became dangerous. Edward couldn't afford exposure. Edwin's death, however it began, became inevitable. And Tilling? Cray asked. Tilling, I believe, learned the truth piece by piece, perhaps from Clarice's returned letters, perhaps from Martin's frightened observations. Once he had enough, he made the mistake of confronting the wrong person. And Edward silenced him too. More carefully this time. He let Randall take the blame. Then disappeared, just before the net closed in. Cray stood, anger flickering beneath. The fatigue. And now he's gone again. For now, she replied, but he leaves a trail. He always has. Cray exhaled. And you knew from the start. Miss Marple shook her head. Not from the start. But once I realized the crime wasn't about what had been done, but about who had been forgotten, the shape of it became clear. Edward needed to be invisible to survive. But when the past refused to stay buried, he chose control over confession. The fire popped in the hearth, the only sound for a long moment. Cray tapped the folder. So what do we tell them? The truth, Miss Marple said, that Randall killed Tilling in a moment of misguided loyalty, that the Colonel was responsible for Edwin's death, but believed the truth would die with him. And that a man, calling himself Hurst, vanished shortly before the case broke open. Leave Edward out, for now. Cray raised an eyebrow. You're letting him go. I'm letting him run, she said, because he'll slip again. They always do. Cray gave her a long look. You've done this before, she smiled gently. Once or twice. That night, the manor settled into quiet again. Martin was resting. Clarice, her past finally separated from her name, prepared to leave in the morning. The Colonel, awaiting formal arraignment, sat in the corner room with nothing but his silence to keep him company. And Miss Marple, alone once more by the fire, held the last photograph in her hand. Not the ones burned or buried. A simple one, found tucked behind a drawer panel, left by Tilling himself. Edwin and Edward. No captions. Just two boys leaning together, laughing. It was that closeness, she realized, that had birthed all of it. Love turned to threat. Trust turned to fear. She placed it back in the drawer and stood. Outside, the wind shifted the ivy again. Somewhere out there, a man was watching shadows, believing himself untouchable. But Miss Marple knew better. They always return, and she would be waiting. The following morning arrived with the hush of closure, though no one dared to call it that aloud. A crisp breeze wound through the hedges of St. Giles Manor, and for the first time in weeks, the household did not stir with whispered dread. Clarice departed at first light, her luggage modest, her departure quiet. Martin, having recovered his voice and a sense of calm, returned to his duties with a new steadiness, though he flinched slightly whenever a door creaked behind him. Inspector Cray stayed one more day to tie up loose ends with the local authorities, though it was clear in his manner that he too felt the puzzle had closed. If not cleanly, then at least completely. Miss Marple lingered longer. She had no pressing reason to remain, but something told her not to leave just yet. It was not unease. Her intuition never ran toward melodrama, but a kind of itch at the edge of her certainty. She had walked through the crimes piece by piece, fitted motive to action, uncovered deception with care. Edward Greaves, long thought vanished or institutionalized, had re-emerged in the background of his own family's tragedy, carefully maneuvering others into taking the blame for what he couldn't afford to be seen doing himself. He had disappeared again, but not without leaving cracks in the silence. Mid-morning found her once more in the library, as the last light of autumn stretched across the oak-paneled floor. Cray had gone to collect a final witness statement from a villager, and the house was still. She sifted through the desk drawers not in hope of discovery, but in habit. One last glance before departure. Most drawers were empty now, cleared by staff or the inspector's team. At the bottom right drawer, stiff in its runners, creaked open to reveal something odd. A book of poetry. Thin, leather-bound, its edges worn but unremarkable. It was not the book itself that caught her attention, but the folded paper tucked behind its back cover. She drew it out slowly. The paper was blank on one side. On the other, in faded pencil, were a few brief lines. I am not what they remember. I am what they forgot. There was no signature, no date, but the handwriting was unmistakable. She had seen it before, scratched on a gardener's tool ledger, printed carefully in a note to Randall about the roses, slanted with that same leftward pull that betrayed the writer's effort to control his own hand. Edward. She read the words again, then placed the page back inside the book and returned it to the drawer. It wasn't evidence. Not really. It was something else entirely. Neither a confession nor a threat. More like a whisper to himself. A man rebuilding his identity from what had been taken or perhaps discarded long ago. The page was not meant for anyone to find, but he had left it all the same. That night, the manor hosted one final supper, more out of ritual than celebration. Clarice gone, the colonel imprisoned, and Randall awaiting trial in silence. The household now held the air of something emptied. The corridors no longer pulsed with secrets, only echoes. As the table was cleared and the staff retired, Cray approached. Miss Marple one last time. You're not staying the night, then? She shook her head gently. No, I think it's time. Cray hesitated, then said, You know, I was reviewing your timeline. Everything checks out except one thing. The morning after Tilling's death, when the fire had burned out and the body was discovered. You said the ashes in the grate weren't cold yet. But by then, at that hour, they should have been. Miss Marple gave a soft smile. Yes. I thought you might notice that eventually. He waited, and when she offered nothing more, he asked, So what does it mean? It means someone returned to the library after the death, relit the fire briefly to burn something else, then left it to smolder. I suspect it was Randall. She may have believed she was tidying up. But more than that, it means Tilling died later than we estimated. He was alive longer than we thought. Cray blinked. So, Edward, he came later. I believe so, she said. The timeline only fits if someone else confronted Tilling first, perhaps threatened him, argued with him, Randall, or perhaps even the colonel. But Edward, he came back to finish the silence. The rest had already set the stage. Cray looked down, thoughtful. So everyone played a part. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. They always do, but it takes someone colder to tie the last knot. They parted with polite words, a shared understanding between those who had stared too long at the seam between truth and perception. She left the next morning just after sunrise, her bags light, her manner unhurried. Yet as the carriage passed the last stone gatepost in the manor slipped behind her, she found her gaze lingering on the hills beyond. Somewhere out there, a man named Edward walked under another name. Perhaps he would settle in another village. Perhaps he would disappear entirely. Or perhaps, most troubling, he would return again in another shape. Just as quiet, just as calculating. 3 days later, back in her small cottage in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple received a package with no return address. Inside was a book, collected poems of Christina Rossetti, the same edition from the Manor's library. She turned the pages gently, stopping at the back cover. The folded note was gone, but something else had been slipped inside. A single pressed flower, a dried gardenia, paper thin. There was no message, no signature. But Miss Marple smiled anyway, because in mystery, as in gardens, some roots always remain beneath the surface, and there was always another season coming.